Okay, everybody, welcome. Today is April 9th. We are continuing Tractate Chagiga. We are just finishing 12b in Tractate Chagiga, and we are going to be up onto 13a in a moment, and we'll be able to continue our conversation of the Mishnah at that point. Okay, so at the very end of 12b, I tried to fit something in really in far too rushed a manner at the end of our last session before Pesach, and I do want to draw your attention to the rabbi's library. If you look on page, you've got 12b, the page in the Sansino that begins, "There is no contradiction," or actually right before that, there's a paragraph of Aravot. 12b, there's a lot of 12b's. It's the 12b that on the top has continuation of translation from previous page as indicated by a triangle. Lord doth command his loving kindness. Okay, this is from the Sansino.
The last 12b page.
Yes, right before we go to 13a. And at the bottom, remember we were doing the teaching of Reish Lakish that there are 7 heavenly realms, all of which are called Shamayim, all of which are called heaven. So when God created the heaven and the earth, according to Reish Lakish, heaven means 7 heavens. And he gave names to all of them, which you'll see on the previous page under the teaching of Rabbi Judah, Rabbi Yehuda. It said 2 firmaments, and then Reish Lakish said there are 7, and they were named Vilon, Rakia, Shechakim, Zvul, Ma'on, Makon, and Aravot. Machon, actually. And we've gone through all of them, and then it does Aravot. Okay? What is interesting that we missed is then turn to 13a. He's trying to resolve the idea of darkness and is there any darkness before God's throne? At the end of the Aravot conversation, he had said that Aravot includes all of the souls of the people who were ever born, all the souls of all the people who will ever be born, and then he named the most famous of the angelic messengers or heavenly beasts that you've heard of from the prophets, like the Seraphim, the Ophanim, the Chayot HaKodesh, which is in our liturgy, it's in the Kedusha, it's in the prophet Isaiah, in a number of places that these Seraphim or Ophanim or angelic beings seem to exist. So they're also on that highest level. And then it has the proof that this is the highest level closest to God, because God is Rochev Aravot, and it uses some ideas of God being a rider on the highest heavens and associated with these various beings. And then they say that there is also just above that another kind of space. There's an inner space and an outer space, and there's darkness and there's light, and then they ask a question, how can you have darkness in the presence of God? So if darkness is the absence of light, how can God have anything that is absent? How can anything that's missing be present in the presence of God? That would mean that God himself is somehow missing something, that absence or lack can survive in the presence of God. God is constantly overflowing, fulfilling, giving, creating, loving. There is no absence, there is no lack in him. So you can't say that in contact with God is anything that could be lacking anything, because it would be immediately filled by the overwhelming presence of God. That's their theological argument, okay? That argument, by the way, does not get resolved here in the Talmud, and that argument becomes one of the major topics of philosophical Judaism in the Aristotelian school, of Rambam and Ralbag, and interacting with the academics of Islam and Greek philosophy. This becomes a big bugaboo in the Middle Ages. For centuries, people are debating this topic of, is a lack a thing, and can a lack be present in the presence of God?
Are we still debating it today?
Not actively. But it's like some other medieval debates. It's one of those things that can't really be resolved unless you're in the presence of God, and I'm not really in a hurry for that. So I can live with the lack of certainty in the meantime. Okay, so they get into this on the last page of 12b in the Sonsino. They get into this, behold, it is written, he reveals the deep and secret things. He knows what is in the darkness, and the light dwells in him. And that quote means he knows darkness, but the darkness isn't what's with him. It's the light that dwells with him. Now, I rushed to try to get to the next quote from the Mishnah, and I did us a disservice by doing that. So, there's no contradiction, the Talmud says, and then we get to the top of 13a. Okay, so how are they going to resolve that there's no contradiction? It says, it talks about the inner chambers, in other words, the darkness, and the other, the outer chambers. And Rav Acha ben Yaakov said, there is still another heaven above the heads of the living creatures, as it is written, and over the heads of the living creatures there was a likeness of a firmament, like the color of the terrible ice, stretched forth over their heads above. There are lots of different ways to translate those words. A lot of those words we don't know what they mean. A lot of those words in imagery as far as being around God are words that make us uncomfortable, and so they are used as metaphor, they are used as symbol, but you should know it's not by accident. That quote is from Ezekiel, and that quote is from the vision of the chariot that we read on Erev Shavuot, and it's the vision of the chariot that is the most restrictive of the things you're not allowed to talk about according to the Mishnah that started this chapter. So as we get to the end of all of the creation conversation, what's happening here is that the Stam of the Gemara, the editor of the Gemara, has come in and said, now let's get back to the next topic. So we've talked about what we can talk about. So what are you not allowed to talk about according to the Mishnah? That which is above, that which is below, that which is before, and that which is after. But it doesn't say above and below what, and it doesn't say before and after what. And everything that happened in this first page or more of Talmud dove into physical creation and the structure of the created universe. 7 heavens, firmaments. Remember, underneath the earth there were lakes and wells, and there was, the pillars, and then the oceans on the pillars, and the wind on the oceans, and so on and so forth. So they've built this kind of, structure, this kind of, an erector set view of all of the scaffolding underneath and all the scaffolding above the world that we are living within. And they do see some distance between the presence of God and the chaotic waters below, and that we are somehow protected by the scaffolding above and below. That's what they've done. But now what happens is you get this quote from Ezekiel when you get to the highest level of this scaffolding above us, which is presumably holding up the dome of darkness or whatever, the limits of the physical world beyond which there can only be God. There's going to be some point where you say, now I'm at the ceiling. I'm like, in the bubble room of Willy Wonka, and I've made it to the top. And if I, and there's danger up there, right? We don't go there, right? And so the Mishnah seems to be prohibiting us from trying to go there intellectually in our imaginations and conversations, certainly in our teaching situations, not to air that stuff in public, right? So at this moment, we get an Ezekiel verse to finish off the limits of the physical conversation. That is an elegant choice by the editor of the Talmud to close the physical conversation with a proof text that actually indicates that slightly higher realm. That's an elegant choice. Okay, so he does that. Rav Acha bar Yaakov said there's still another heaven. This is what we were just talking about. And over the heads of the living creatures, there was a likeness of the firmament, like the color of the terrible ice, spreading forth over their heads above. Thus far you have permission to speak. Thenceforward you have not permission to speak, for so it was written in the book of Ben Sirah. We're going to get to that in a second. And the quote is, seek not things that are too hard for thee. Search not out things that are hidden from thee. The things that have been permitted thee, think thereupon. Thou hast no business with the things that are secret. Okay? Before we talk about Ben Sirah, is that a good proof text?
Yeah.
Certainly hits the nail on the head. Right? Up until this moment, we've been given permission to talk. once we get to this level of the upper realms of heavens, this is where the prohibition comes to bear. The problem is that there's no such prohibition stated in Torah. There's no such prohibition stated in prophets or in writings. Nowhere in Tanakh, in Hebrew Bible, is that prohibition stated. Where does that prohibition come from? Evidently from Ben Sira, which is not one of our sacred books.
Right. Doesn't in the Torah it says that I'm giving you this information that it's not in the above the heaven above.
Well, in the Torah, you're talking about Lo B'Shamayim here in Deuteronomy. So there's a command in Deuteronomy. It's not a command. It says Lo B'Shamayim Lo Me'aver Hayam. There's a command that says the Torah is not in heaven and it is not beyond the sea. It is not too far from you to say who shall go and get it. Nay, it is in fact near to you and close at hand, is the full verse. So the Torah is not heavenly in that sense. Its origins may be heavenly, but its reality is earthly, in your hands to use it. So Moses is saying there that the Torah and its commands are not a mystery. Read the book, do what it says. Don't break your heads over this. Don't get too complex. Just, it's in your hands. Take care of it. This is a whole nother thing. This is like, and by the way, what is in heaven? And there's 7 heavens, and the highest heaven. And then we get to the vision of Ezekiel, beyond which we're not allowed to talk. So Ben Sira is writing in the first third of the 2nd century. He writes from about the year, let's just roughly say 100 to 130. That makes him pre-Bar Kokhba. So he is under Roman destruction, but prior to the ultimately failed Jewish rebellion. So he is at a time where a lot of things are happening in Judaism. Things have gone terribly wrong. The temple lies in ruins. Rome is ensconced as a brutal, oppressive military occupier at this time. Jerusalem has been taken to the ground and rebuilt as a Roman city. If you've been to Jerusalem today and you've gone to the Cardo, and you have those beautiful columns left in this street and all the shopping that would have happened there, and quite frankly, the Western style shopping that is there today may actually be ironically appropriate for the Cardo, depending on your view of such things. This was not a street. You know, I've gone to tour. I've heard tour guides say, "Imagine Rabbi Akiva walking down these streets, touching these pillars." They would have executed him on the spot had he walked down that street and touched those pillars, because that street and those pillars were built as Aelia Capitolina after the destruction, after the forcible expulsion of Jews from the city, and Jews were not allowed into the city on pain of death. Wrong street. Walk 10 minutes down the stairs to the western wall, go to Robinson's Arch and look at those flagstones, and now give the same speech. Rabbi Akiva walked down the street. Now you're good. You're in the archaeologically correct spot in Jerusalem. So this is when this is going on, and Ben Sira is writing during that time period. So you have the passions of Jewish hope and rebellion against Rome, and as we saw with the advent of Christianity at this time in that place, you have messianic hopes. You also have within Judaism hopes for the return of the kingdom of David, not like those lousy, corrupt Hasmonean kings who are puppets of Rome at this point, but the true Davidic kingdom, you know, and all this kind of stuff is in play. So Ben Sira is writing in that time period. He gets quoted a lot. He gets quoted by Midrash. He gets quoted by Talmud. He's known. He also, however, gets condemned by some of those same voices. There's actually one voice that says the minim, the heretics, and people who do things like read Ben Sira, right, should basically be killed or have no place in the world to come, because they're heretics. They're not studying Torah and what becomes Mishnah. So even while the Talmudic world quotes Ben Sira, there are elements of the same world that created the Mishnah and the Talmud that had an opposite view of Ben Sira. Ben Sira does not make it into the Hebrew Bible. But here he's getting quoted as a proof text. Not only a proof text, but probably the source of the prohibition against this kind of philosophical speculation.
I never understood that. I mean, I've studied other sections of the Gemara, where Ben Sira was quoted, and I'd heard that he was. How can you quote as a proof text a writer who was?
Because he says exactly what we want him to say.
I can do that.
We have a problem with Ben Sira when he says things that contradict Mishnah, but if he's got something that completely supports Mishnah, he's going to get quoted and everyone's going to love it. Especially since Mishnah, as you have seen, has been tortured to find on what basis it could possibly be ruling this way. The Minahan Emile, or Minalan questions at the beginning of the Gemara of this chapter, on what basis do you teach this, never got sufficiently answered. And the only place where we've got a nail, a hammer hitting the nail on the head of a prohibition is Ben Sira. And I think it's their ambivalence that it waited this long to tuck it in right before we abandoned the topic.
Well, that was a matter of editing, wasn't it?
Yes. So the earlier Sugiot and Baraitot, Reish Lakish did not quote Ben Sira. Rav Acha did not quote Ben Sira. So the late Baraitot and the early teachings of the Amoraim don't do that. They don't. So, but here the editor of the Talmud, tucking it in before moving on to the next line of the Mishnah, has put Ben Sira in here, I think, as a fait accompli. Now you're talking about an editor 300-400 years after Ben Sira, and the book has legs. People kept reading it. It's still around. It's like Hanukkah. It's just an annoying little holiday that never went away. So, okay, we embraced it. Right? Because it's not in the Mishnah. Hanukkah's not in the Mishnah. Why? Because there's ambivalence between the Hasmonean kings and the rabbinic class, and there was violence and bloodshed, and it was a triumphant Hasmonean celebration of their glorious ancestors who had given us the temple back, and other people maybe didn't want Hasmonean holidays. But by the time all bets are off, the holiday keeps going, it becomes the holiday that's core to Judaism, and the Hasmoneans win. There's like two Hanukkah miracles. One is the Hanukkah miracle, and the second is that Hanukkah is still around. Because it was so trapped within the politics of the day. The fact that it emerged, I think, is proof of the divinity of the holiday. Because all of the social, political, economic forces would be against Hanukkah continuing. Right? But it did. It has a life to it, it has a power to it.
You don't credit Christmas?
Your historiography is backwards. Okay, so anyways, Ben Sira comes in, and in my rush last time, I really didn't note how remarkable historically, theologically, textually, and so forth it is that Ben Sira comes in here with your perfect proof text without qualification. However, the next paragraph, which the editor also slips in here before moving on, is the story of a heretic. And while it seems different, I think that that's also an acknowledgement that the last couple things coming in here are not reflecting mainstream ideal things. So we had Ben Sira, and then it says, it is taught. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai said, what answer did the Bat Kol give to the wicked one when he said, I will ascend above the heights of the clouds, I will be like the Most High? So remember, when last we met, we were at above the heights of the clouds. We were up to the point just short of God's self, in the highest heaven of the heavens. The ultimate in arrogation by an evil, wicked emperor, in this case Nebuchadnezzar, as being described in the prophet Isaiah, understood that way by the rabbis, that this is who we're talking about, arrogates to himself that he, like the people at the Tower of Babel, will himself ascend up and overthrow God. Right? So the rabbis have him, Pharaoh, and others take on this kind of role of throwing the gauntlet down in front of God, thinking they're bigger than God, putting God in the position of having to crush them and have prophecy come against them and all that other kind of stuff. So, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, Abat Kol, by the way, is how the rabbis talk about the voice of God. They did have many stories where the voice of God is still talking. Abat Kol means a little voice. Right? So something's going on, and a Bat Kol comes and actually speaks and says what God in heaven has to say on the topic.
Isn't there a famous bat kol with the oven?
Yeah, the Tanur Shalachnai on Bava Metzia 57b, something like that, is like one of the. If you're a conservative Jew, it's like it's right up there with Breshit, Shemot, and Vayikra. It's like the sacred text of our movement, and it also quotes the Lo B'Shamayim. It's the story of a rabbi who is outnumbered by all the other rabbis in his ruling about the kashrut of an oven and its permissibility, and the rabbi uses nature, wonder, miracles to show that God is on his side, and and they are ever escalating, and each time the assembled rabbis rebuke both the source of the miracle, it's a river flowing backwards and things like that, it's a tree levitating and rooting itself back down in the ground somewhere else, and each time they rebuke the river, they rebuke the tree, the walls of the study house start to fall, they rebuke the walls, they say, you have no right to get involved in our conversations, lo b'shamayim hi, heaven doesn't get to vote on the halacha anymore, it was given to us, we determine the halacha, and the bat kol comes out at the end and says, nitzchuni banai, my children have vanquished me, with appreciation that they have learned the lessons so well that they can, because the bat kol is saying this other rabbi is right. I made the waters flow backward, he's right. I made the tree levitate, he's right. I made the study house start to fall down, he's right. And they say, but you gave us the Torah, it's not yours anymore. And he says, you're also right. Right, and so that's a bat kol. So that's the famous. But there's a lot of different bat kol moments.
No, but that one of my teachers said is the favorite of
It's the
Jewish
favorite.
theological.
It's the favorite of JTS. You don't get far in the conservative movement without finding that. I saw people teaching it at Ramah one summer. You're ever younger. In any event, the bat kol here is rebuking that one, and the bat kol goes forth and says, "O wicked man, son of a wicked man, grandson of Nimrod." You want to insult somebody, call him a grandson of Nimrod. "The wicked, who stirred the whole world in rebellion against me by his rule, how many are the years of man?" So you're kind of getting the Job answer, like, who are you to talk to me? Right? You guys don't be so chutzpahdik to challenge what I'm doing with my reality and who's in charge, because you come and go like blades of grass. 70, for it is said, the days of our years are 70, or by reason of strength 80 years. But the distance from the earth to the firmament is a journey of 500 years. So now we're getting back to that concept of how high do the heavens go? 500 years, and the thickness of the firmament is a journey of 500 years. So once you bump your head on the ceiling, it took you 500 years to get there. To tunnel your way through it would be another 500 years. And likewise, the distance from one firmament to the other, implied, would be another 500 years. And above them are the holy creatures. The feet of the living creatures are equal to all of them together. So you have like a seraph or an ophan or some heavenly creature up there, and its foot alone is equal to those 1,500 years that you've already gone trying to go up there. And the ankles are equal to all of them, so the ankle is another 1,500 years. And the legs of the living creature, all of them, another 1,500 years. The knees of the living creatures are equal to all of them. The thighs of the living creatures are equal to all of them. Anyone doing the math, I've lost track. The bodies are equal to all of them. The necks are equal to all of them. The heads are equal to all of them. The horns of the living creatures are equal to all of them. And above them is the throne of glory. The feet of the throne of glory are equal to all of them. The throne is equal to all of them. And the King, the living, eternal God, high and exalted, dwelleth above them all. So there's at least like 10 things there, which are 500 years, there's 10 things there that are like 1,500 each, and there was 3 things that added 1,500. I mean, you've got 10,000 years worth of journeying before you could ever get to the throne of God. And God dwells above them all. The King, the living, exalted, God, high and exalted, dwelleth above them, yet you, you son of a Nimrod, say, I will ascend above the heights of the clouds, and I will be like the Most High. Nay, you shall be brought down to the netherworld, to the uttermost parts of the pit, which is also in Isaiah. Okay. And so we end with an admonition against what? What's the purpose of that? well expanded, even exaggerated final tirade.
You are never going to be able to see God and be on an equal basis. And if you think so, you're kidding yourself.
It's exactly right. You will never get to that place. And you're fooling yourself. You not just arrogant, but you Russia, you evil person. That level of chutzpah that you think, you puny little, 70, 80 years, 100, 110, it's nothing. It would take you 10, 15,000 years to get to his little toe, metaphorically, as if he had a little toe. Which is a lovely children's book, by the way. Does God have a big toe? You should go look at it. If you've got grandchildren, you should get that one. So, and if you think you can, you are like Nebuchadnezzar. Okay? How does that fit in the Gemara as far as what we're doing in this chapter?
Well, it's an issue of studying of what you're permitted to learn right from the beginning. And this is, we hit the limit some time ago.
So it's reinforcing the prohibition, right? The prohibition about what you can't study, what you can't learn, what you can't teach. Now, remember, Maaseh Breshit was forbidden among how many people? Two.
Plus a teacher.
2 plus 1, we think. That's how Rashi read it. Okay? So it was forbidden sexual stuff was 3, Breshit was 2, and the chariot is 1. So it's not like you're not allowed to do it at all, and yet you should know there's a limit, because the Mishnah ends with, and anyone who's not chas al kono, doesn't worry about his maker, it's better he never came into the world, and anyone who says what's above, what's below, what's before, what's after, well, now we have a definition of that. Not only do we have a definition of that, but we have a midrash halacha, a midrashic interpretation of a verse from Isaiah that is being used now to prove that there's a point beyond which it would be evil of you to continue to have arrogance or chutzpah to think that you can talk about it or be there. Now, that's the best proof text from the canon, from sacred literature that we have. Is it a strong proof text? Is Isaiah enough to say we have a prohibition that the Mishnah can base itself on? Like this. It twists itself around to find its way there. It's a lot of midrash in that interpretation to get you to that level of prohibition. I think that rabbinically that works. So you don't need Ben Sira. And what the editor of the Gemara has done here is put our best canonized proof text at the end of the conversation, even though we know the home run was hit by Ben Sira. So, it's like putting Stanton in behind Judge if you're a Yankee fan, right? So Judge hit the home run and Stanton struck out, right? But you put Stanton in because he's the famous guy. So then you have this is the proof text that's supposed to work, and the Gemara comes to a close on that topic for now. So let's touch base. Let's just check in. We have now completed one topic associated with one sentence out of a Mishnah that was a paragraph long. How many of you have studied Talmud before? Okay. How many of you, this is Talmud for your first time? Okay, so we're half and half in the room. First timers. Let's just take a minute or two and touch base. Is this what you expected? How is this not what you expected? What's this literature doing as a study? I had one person who didn't come back after the first session who said, why are we doing this? Right? And that is a practical question. That's a person who wants to have a concrete outcome that can be applied to better living, which doesn't seem to be what we're doing. So reactions to the experience of studying this kind of material. Thoughts?
I expected more, let's say, theory based on fact.
You expected more theory based on fact. So they would say, we've seen these things happen, and therefore this is what we believe.
Right. No, they haven't seen God create
Right?
anything,
Right?
but they only theorized that he did this.
So what are the facts that they build their theories on? Because the rabbis are not dumb. These are smart people working really hard, dedicating their life's work to this enterprise. But what are the facts for them? What is the source of fact?
Well, there is a heaven and there is an earth.
Okay, the realities are there's a heaven and earth. We can look at it, we can describe it.
They don't know how far up heaven is. They
Right.
don't know how deep earth goes.
There's no rocketry and
Right.
there's
They
no
don't
deep
have
drilling.
Today's scientific.
They don't know where the limits are,
Right.
so they're doing their best.
And they certainly don't know what before and after means.
Okay? What else? What's the basis of their fact? Where do they look for facts?
It's there.
In the Torah, right? Torah is how they prove things. So if you can't find it in the Torah, which in this case we've realized that the Mishnah, its prohibition is not based in the Torah clearly, right? It may be slightly, but it's not clearly. It's not like saying you shall not boil a kid in the mother's milk. You've got something where it says it explicitly, right? But the Torah is the font of fact. That is where true knowledge comes
Their
from.
interpretation.
And they interpret. And their interpretations are far-ranging. Are their interpretations, do they resolve? Do they agree?
No,
Ha-
there's
ha-
controversy.
in the page and a half that we've studied together, have they resolved their conflicts?
To some degree.
A little bit. They haven't undermined the basic prohibition, so they seem to still be working within that. What the Mishnah has prohibited, they haven't said, therefore we don't have to. They're working within that prohibition. So that assumption remains in place. That's the boundary of the conversation. Okay, so the Mishnah is the unspoken authority still. And they're looking for Torah to back the Mishnah up. In that enterprise, we think that they have not always been elegant. It hasn't always been, a clearly choreographed discussion, which is, okay, people are messy. Torah study is messy. You have hundreds of people over centuries debating this stuff, and the mess is the fun of it. So Talmud is messy. That should be your first outcome, right? Messy.
And I've been studying for many years, and I can tell you the value more than anything else for me is I can now understand these people better. It gives you a telescope into their lives. It gives you, if they were worrying about it, or they were, when you say people are discussing something or talking about it, it's because it's part of what they were concerned about in those days. And this way, if they accept something as a topic to discuss, it means it was relevant to them. And that tells you about them. Someday, all the stuff we're going through politically now, some kid, some great-grandchild of ours will read about it in a history book and say, oh my God, these people were sitting there reading. And every day I read the Washington Post and the Times on my iPad, and I go nuts. And so people will look back and see what we were going through, and what this is doing. What is so valuable about this is we can understand what they were worrying about.
So it is a window into human experience in another time and place, and Jewish human experience. So it is our experience if we were in a different time and place. So, the sci-fi of time travel, what drives the tension of sci-fi of time travel is the concept that you yourself are now in that other place. And how do you yourself interact in that other place, right? And then, of course, in most good fiction, you come to human lessons and human understandings and eternal truths that come out from exploring humanity through that genre. When we do Talmud study, we are discovering ourselves, were we in a different time and place? And what's interesting is sometimes that grows who we are, and we take that into ourselves, and our neshama is nourished by that. And sometimes we find ourselves in such a radically different place that it is hard to hear the things and to remain open. And for many people, that's gender issues, for example, when you bump up against certain things in certain Talmudic literature, people can't let go of who they are today enough to hear who the people were and see themselves in it, because it's radically different enough. So exploring. This is an exploration from which we can, from our reactions, better see ourselves, right? While discovering who they were. The other thing is that they're taking, what is motivating them? Why are they doing this?
Understanding God.
And that's it.
They were really worried about it.
They were, on a daily basis, concerned, what does God want of me? What does God want of us? And I want to be in line with what God wants. And I want to be able to be in harmony with the creator of the cosmos and the commander of Jewish destiny. I want to be on board that ship. I don't want to be just alone out there floating in the ocean of humanity and time. I want to have purpose and meaning and love and relationship and protection. I want to know that what I'm doing is important and worthwhile and meaningful, even if I don't see that shaking my lulav is important. Because by investing in the study and the discovery of the commanding voice of God in Judaism in this thing I'm studying and learning and appropriating and doing in my life, I am assured of its purpose and its meaning, even if I myself, by myself, don't necessarily see it, feel it, hear it, or can articulate it. So they're in a constant desire to know, what does God want? And they presume that what God wants is what's best for me. God wants what's best for me. Not I want what's best for me. God wants what's best for me, and I'm trying not to discover what I want. I'm trying to discover what God wants, because the answer to what I want and the answer to what God wants, there's a better answer. And it's the God wants answer that's going to be the better answer. Right? That's what's happening over the centuries. Phil.
Yeah, but God's so concerned whether I shake the lulav this way or that.
Deeply. Is God concerned if the lulav goes this way or that way? I think the way our system is built, God seems concerned that we shake the lulav in a harmonious manner as a community. So the fact that if I could rewind the lulav history and run it forward 10 times, is there a probability here that the lulav might come out differently in 2 of those 10 times? Right? Maybe. If you reran history 10 times, maybe there's enough variables that we would have decided to go counterclockwise instead of clockwise. And I think the fact that there's a process of deciding and committing and doing that spans generations for our people is what God wants. And so I don't know that God cares if I go clockwise or counterclockwise, but I do think that God cares whether or not we are all involved in this together and doing this in, if not always an identical way, what I call a harmonious way. I think that is important to God. When I look at Jewish history, that seems to be what we have been about. Those are the things that have survived chaos and oppression and murder and war, is the Jewish bondedness over finding common expression of the rituals.
God doesn't seem so concerned with, with being 400 years in Egypt and then had slavery. That's
God doesn't seem so concerned with being in Egypt 400 years, that's not so important. Then why would God go through all the trouble of telling Abraham that that was going to happen and he should be knowledgeable that it will come to an end and his children will be more numerous than the stars in heaven? I think he's worried about the experience that we're going to undergo. Not worried enough to protect us from it, but worried enough to give us a heads up that we'll get through it, not without losses. Now, that was acceptable theology before World War II. Since World War II, that leaves a bitter taste in our mouth. And I can't solve that in a Talmud shiur in 2 minutes. I think there are answers there, but those answers take time. Here, yeah.
What about the modern rabbis today that are studying the Talmud? Is their opinions different from what was written?
As a modern rabbi who studies Talmud, I'll try and answer you. Yes, our opinions differ from what's written in the Talmud. They can't,
Because of time?
because of time, because of formation, because I may come up with something that nobody ever thought of before. I mean, why would God keep creating people if we're never going to have an original thought? What a waste. Somebody will always have done everything you do better at some point. You're just muddling your way through. What's the point? So I think that we all bring a uniqueness, and I think that each of our souls is given this shot at life because of a unique potential destiny. And I think that when each of us brings ourself to the conversation of Talmud, we not only grow the margins of the page as far as commentaries and commentaries, I think we actually are a megaphone for Sinai. I think that the voice of revelation continues to speak as a result of our amplifying the voices that have already spoken.
So is it different from what their interpretation is?
Can be, sure. I don't think that the rabbis of the Mishnah would have ordained a woman as a rabbi. But I think the rabbis of the Mishnah living today would ordain a woman as a rabbi. Right? I don't know that I, living then, would have had the frame of mind that I have. So the practical outcome of halacha it will be different based on who you are and where you are. The metaphor I like to use just for fun, going back to my earlier days, my less rabbinic days, is it would work, by the way, with a sponge cake recipe, but I use beer. So you have a good recipe for beer, how to make beer. And you have ingredients. You need hops and barley or wheat and a little bit of sugar in the mash of some kind, and yeast and water and care and time and temperature and so forth. If you live in Poland, the hops and the barley are subtly different than if you live in Yemen. You can still grow these things, but they are going to be different. You can follow the recipe identically, but because the ingredients of your time and place are different, it will come out subtly different. It will have a different color, a different character, a different flavor. And why I like the beer recipe more than the sponge cake is because it will still have the same effect. Sponge cake will have the same effect too, but I don't like the image. I'd rather somebody get a little happy than a little heavy, right? So it is still beer, and it is the same recipe, but it is of necessity different because of the ingredients brought at any particular time and place. We are the time and place ingredients that differ with a recipe that hasn't changed. The recipe is the covenant of God, Torah, and Israel. And we bring to the table who we are, and that changes the look and the flavor and the color of the beer. And that happens, by the way, everywhere. That happens in Orthodoxy, it happens in Hasidic Orthodoxy, it happens in Reform, it happens in Conservative. No generation or community of Jews today is the same as their ancestors 10 generations ago. No one is the same. They have all changed. They have all changed halachic standards. They have all changed communal norms. They have all changed. For some of them, the recipe includes a self-understanding that they have not changed. That's part of their identity. But they can't help but be different because they are different. And so that's the positive historical approach of conservative
I
Judaism.
don't understand your comment that at least in the Hasidic world,
Yeah.
let alone the modern world.
They have changed.
Halachically?
They have changed.
Halachically?
Halachically, they have changed.
Give me an example.
Ah. Nutnik.
Years ago, they allowed secular education, and now they don't want secular education. That's the major.
20 years ago, nobody thought water needed a hechsher. Now water needs a hechsher.
Yeah.
A rabbinic seal to tell you it's kosher.
Kosher.
Oh,
Everybody
Things change. Everybody changes. Every community's halacha develops. Every community's social norms adapt. Every single community. It's the nature of humanity.
Well, if you say so, okay.
Well, let's take the Hasidic community. There wasn't a Hasidic community before the Hasidic communities. Where did they come from? Do they think the people prior to the Hasidic communities were less faithful, were less religious, were less orthodox, were doing things wrong? So if you were to do the things that the first Hasidim's great-grandparents did, if you were to do that in their community today, it would be offensive and wrong.
That's true.
Right? So which is it? Things never changed or things do change?
No, things change
And when they change, does that mean that the older people were wrong? Well, you can't do that. You can't declare your grandparents sinners. So, but you can't do that anymore either. My favorite is I had a conversation with, there was a young Orthodox rabbi in a previous community that I lived in who was sniffing me out to figure out if he would be comfortable eating in my kitchen. And my experience tells me by the time you're asking those questions, you're not going to eat in my kitchen. Not because I do anything wrong whatsoever by your standards, but because you're expressing a discomfort, you're going to find an excuse. Right? So I was describing things that I know to be correct by all standards. For example, cooking parv in bishul shel yom. So if you cook normal meat in a pot and you clean and the pot's dry for more than 24 hours, and then you cook vegetables in the pot, those vegetables are parv. They're parv. You can take them out, store them in Tupperware, and then serve them in a dairy meal. You could serve them in a dairy meal right away. They're parv. Now, there are some qualifying characteristics, where there are onions in it and stuff like that, but as a general rule, that is possible. It's very hard to find like a mashgiach who's going to let you do that these days. And so they'll say, well, that's the way we used to do it. But now we prefer. So they can't say it's not kosher, but then they've come to such a place of change on that topic that they won't tell you that it is kosher.
They can afford 2 sets of pots. That's the big difference.
Well, there's
Back in the old days, they only had the 1 set of pots.
But it gets enforced now on people who can't afford 2 pots. So, you always have this kind of tension. Those are just small and inane examples of just a basic rule that human beings are never the same. And covenant God, Torah, and Israel is the eternal document. Why does every letter of the Torah have to be perfectly exact or you can't read from it? Because something has to be the thing that never changes. Otherwise, all bets are off and it can be anything. And the rabbis are anchored into finding that Torah hook to hang themselves a good argument on that hook. Otherwise, they are basically susceptible to assimilation and the loss of Jewish norms. Because without the Torah hook, you can go anywhere. And bringing in Ben Sira as a proof text is a dangerous, dangerous thing for the halachic Talmudic process.
Wait a minute.
Like the new Shabbos refrigerator. I read that in the,
All right, let me make your last statement, and then let's try and get into the next subject before the class ends.
Well, I think that the frustration...
Fascinating side talk, by the way. But I wanted to kind of stop and reflect on what it is we're doing for a little bit before we dive back in.
I still want to reflect on it. I think the frustration for less than regular students of Talmud who study irregularly is that it never seems to connect to halacha.
Right.
You never get there.
You don't learn Talmud from you don't learn halacha from Talmud.
So
Correct.
The question that the student who left us is not unusual. Then why do we study? In other words, what's the point?
Well, the answer is unfortunately it reflects a validation bias, which is not a good way to go about doing things. The reason we study Talmud is because we enjoy it. So for the person who's sitting there saying, I really didn't enjoy that, to tell them it's because it's fun is like telling someone who hates roller coasters that I ride roller coasters because they're fun, right? For them, it's a nightmare, right? So for some people, Talmud is a nightmare. I reflect that. It's not for everybody, but it is the source of it all because this is how we are these are the concerns we are supposed to have. This is the process we're supposed to go through when we do seek what God wants from us today. And when we seek to know the halakha today, right? So, can tofu be kosher for Passover? They never heard of tofu. Is a turkey kosher? It's a bird that they never heard of. How do you kosher a microwave, right? This is a good one that came up the other day. In the laws of Liverite marriage, so Liverite marriage is a biblical command that if a man dies, a married man dies before he has children, and he has a brother, his widow needs to have a child with his brother and name the child as the son of the dead guy to perpetuate his legacy within Israel, and it goes all the way back to inheritance law in the Bible so that the tribal lands would never be lost. Okay? That mitzvah is still on the books today. And there are people who still observe this, usually through the ritual of chalitza, which lets you out of that.
Or if you don't have a brother.
That's not. Let me ask my own troubling questions. So for the sake of this, my question is, if a man and a woman have had reproductive challenges and they have gone into fertility counseling and they have 15 frozen zygotes from the man's sperm and the woman's eggs ready for implantation, and the man dies and they haven't had a viable child yet, does the brother still have to father a child, or can she continue to try and have a child with the dead guy's progeny?
Just from the question.
And if she has that option and the brother is off the hook, then is he off the hook even if she chooses not to implant? Since the mitzvah is the male's mitzvah, not the woman's, which is why she can do chalitza to reject him.
So what's the answer?
So if, I don't know, it's a great question. But if I were to have someone come to me and say, Rabbi, we have frozen embryos and I want to, there's a chalitza command and they want to do all this stuff, which will never happen in my community. But if it does, I would take it very seriously. Those are the kind of questions that you say, how am I going to answer that question? I'm going to go into Talmudic discourse. I'm going to go back to the original sources. I'm going to see if there's something in Torah. I'm going to see if there's something in Talmud. I'm going to try and go through all the precedent literature about halakha, which says, by the way, that be fruitful and multiply, it can be fulfilled this way, and that the progeny, these are their children, and all that kind of stuff. I'm going to look at all that material, and I'm going to try and come up with what the halakha
Didn't
is.
you consult your teacher?
I would go to my rabbi. Right? I would go to my rabbi. I actually have a rabbi for biomedical issues that I go specifically to on these matters, who's an expert in this field. And he would probably not like the chalitza side of this argument, but he would engage it with me because I'd be asking him to. So those are things that when they come up, if you're if you have the Talmudic desire to discover God's will, and to think that, and to have the faith that what comes out of these processes and conversations will be better than what I would have made up on my own. Not just for me, but for all of us, right? That makes the whole conversation sacred. It makes the conversation bigger than me, and it makes the impact of our lives lasting on future generations in immeasurable ways, without ego. And that's why we study Talmud.
And also, all of those arguments are preserved. What I love over the years is any time there's a discussion, it's very much like our Supreme Court, where we record everybody's opinion, everyone who had an opinion. It's all written down there. Even the people who were terribly wrong and terribly rejected are all in there. And sometimes we sit there and we see the one they rejected wasn't so stupid after all.
So-
And so you sit there and you figure, how did they think in it? And I have a great deal of respect for them.
So the comment in the room is the recording of the conversations, the winning and losing opinions, the ones that we look at and say they're brilliant, and the ones that we look at and say, you're a nice boy. Right?
Thank you for bringing it.
Right? All of that is part of the wonderful nature of all of this as well. And I think Judaism is unique in that way. I don't know of another religion that has managed to maintain such a broad corpus of dissent and discussion, which is important because every once in a while the halakhic process in the Talmud is clearly based in a certain political, cultural, historical reality. That this is this way because the Emperor Titus used to do blank. And then if you live in a time where that driving, deciding variable is other than that, then you get to go back and say, what would Reish Lakish say if that were not true? Well, it's clear if that were not true that Reish Lakish would have agreed with, and you run the argument and you say, well, guess what? That's the current circumstance. And so now the halacha can come out differently now without it being me breaking or abandoning or rejecting or devaluing anything that happened in the generations before. It's the beer recipe. The ingredients have changed, right? If it's always made in a plain wooden cask, it's going to be one way. Well, now the surrounding environment is different. We can't get wooden casks. We live in a desert. We have to make our beer in metal. It's going to be different. And if following that exact beer cask recipe of doing it is going to skunk the beer in metal, and you have to do something else to make the recipe work, then you're being faithful to producing the recipe, even if you now said, don't you dare put that other ingredient in, because in metal it will skunk the beer. Right? You don't just do it the way it was. You achieve the goals of the way it was by doing it the way you have to. This is how they changed the rules of usury and lending at interest with the Prose Bowl. It says quite clearly, when they saw that people were refraining from loaning to the poor in the 6th year because of the 7th year of the forgiveness of debts according to Torah law, they invented a thing called the Prose Bowl to impersonalize the flow of money, to make it possible, to make it profitable, to continue to have loans at interest even through the 7th year when you're supposed to forgive loans. And the reason they did that wasn't because no one's making any money, we need to let people have their Rolls Royce. It was because the purpose of the law was to alleviate poverty. And the observance of the law was making poverty worse. And so they needed to find a halakhic adaptation to achieve the purpose of the law as stated in the Torah to allow the alleviation of poverty. So they changed it. Doesn't happen often, but they changed it not because they didn't like what the Torah said. They changed it because it was the only way to do what the Torah wanted. That's the difference between small r reforming a tradition and small c conserving a tradition. Maybe big R, maybe big C. Phil, I think you get the last word.
But that doesn't seem to be such concern for the Haredi community.
I can't speak for the Haredi
Well,
community.
but you observe them and you understand.
I think that they're not self-aware of the process of change.
That's not really what I'm saying about the people living in poverty.
Correct. Yeah, sometimes observance of Torah norms can aggravate poverty just because it aggravates poverty. It has nothing to do with loans. If you are pru uravu, you're being fruitful and multiplying in large numbers,
And you're studying.
and you're not, and you don't have an offsetting income, whatever that means from your circumstances, then every child you have is increasing poverty. And there's a Torah basis that says, the Torah says, there shall be no poor in your lands. So it's a faith statement. We won't be poor. Maybe this isn't poor. You get the last word.
Can't you look at the way these problems are resolved then, and then apply them to problems you have today?
Yes.
So it really is applicable to today. It's not just an intellectual.
I had a question in my office today about a policy matter in the synagogue, which I won't discuss right now because it's still being discussed, where the rabbinic voice needed to be represented in the considerations. And how did I bring the rabbinic voice to bear? Did I say, I don't like it, here's what you have to do because I say so? I did not. I went back to this process of conversation and I engaged them in a conversation about alternatives and values and what's the value, and if you say this, then this, and if you say that, then this, and let's put it all together and look at the halakhic literature that came before, and this is what it looks to me we should be doing. And here's the realm that's gray, but here are the values involved. What do you think you want to do? And that's how we run contemporary issues. It doesn't work with my kids. I've tried it. One of them actually said, "Stop being a rabbi." I said, "I can't." Okay, so we're going to read the line that I tried to get to, and we'll pick up with this next time. So the next piece of the Mishnah gets picked up on 13a. In the Hebrew, we should have a double dot. Do we have a double dot? Wait. We did Ben Sira. Okay, 13a, middle of the page. Okay, good. If you look at the Hebrew, the narrow column becomes a fat column halfway down the page. If you go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lines up, the fifth to last line of the narrow column, you see something that looks like a colon, 2 dots. It's the second word, and this is velo, b'merkava, b'yachid, and 2 dots. 2 dots followed by 2 dots is a quote from the Mishnah, and it indicates that the Gemara is now picking up a new topic. When this happens, it will drop anything you've been discussing like a brick in a well. It's gone. Done. It may bring that topic back somewhere else in Talmud or in another page, another tractate, or never. But it has got a full stop, clean slate, new quote from the Mishnah. Here we go. By the way, where these Mishnah quotes drop into the middle of the Gemara column was an inventor of the printing press. It's only a couple hundred years old. The printer in Vilnius is the one who put those in. Most of the medieval manuscripts do not have the Gemara subdivided by quotes from the Mishnah. It will have a quote from the Mishnah and then do all the Gemara on it, and then the next and only quote of the next line of the Mishnah, and then all of the Gemara. Manuscripts didn't put all these little breaks in. This is what made the Vilna printing so popular, is that it gave you these little breaks to identify where you were in the sprawling pages of Talmud, and it put the commentaries and study books on the same page with you. All right, so the line is, and nor may one expound upon the Maaseh Merkavah, the deeds of the chariot, even with one student. And remember that the end of that quote was, unless that student could arrive at an understanding of the issues on his own. And what's going to happen next is it's going to say, Tane Rabbi Chia. Rabbi Chia taught in a Baraita. Tane is from Tana, and it means a Mishnah age source. So we're going to start all over, new topic, a Baraita about the prohibition of studying the Mishnah. And we'll do that next Monday, 1 o'clock. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. 12 o'clock.
12 o'clock, right, 12 o'clock.